My name is Joel, and I am the Connections Director here at Story Church, and I'm glad everybody can make it. We're in the week 4 of this series called Iceberg, What's Beneath the Surface, and we've had a lot of fun with it. We've had some great times, and the idea of the series is that we have things in our life that is evident. It's above the surface. It's the icebergs in our lives, but underneath there are all these types of things that we kind of hide, we kind of hold down, and we don't allow them to come to the surface so we can be healthier people. And this week, we're actually going to talk about loss and grief. And it's going to be so exciting. I want to show actually this picture we've been showing the last few weeks here to kind of give you an idea. So this thing is massive underneath here, right? Okay? And so the idea is that everything underneath can be just way more massive than everything we see on the top. And I don't know about you guys, every week when I've seen this picture, Ice Baby kind of pops in my head. I know any of you guys too? No? Anyway, so just want to, next time, if Jeremy uses it next week, just think Ice Baby and just smile and he won't know what's going on. But anyways, so we're talking about grief and loss. And, here's the thing. If as we get older, as time goes by, there's, loss is going to happen. And I want to start off by saying here that loss is unavoidable, but grief is a choice. If you're taking notes today, go ahead and write that down. Loss is unavoidable, but grief is a choice. And, I don't know about you, but as I've gotten older, as I've gone through life, every time I go and look in the mirror, I'm kind of reminded of already some loss here. I'm starting to see a little more of my scalp as they go. Some of you guys know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah? Or, if you've ever had a hamster or goldfish, those critters don't get, 3 months? Right? Everybody experiences that type of a loss. It's unavoidable. Or if you're a Duke fan, first round of the NCAA tournament every few years. Sorry, you can't argue me with that joke. I'm good till the next tournament. They have to get the second round, then I'll stop the jokes. Anyways, go Heels. But on a serious note, loss really is unavoidable. It could be death. It could be death of a family member, a friend, even a pet. These type of things, they can affect us. Or it could be relationships. It could be, a marriage. It could be, a friendship. These type of things. Sometimes we lose these things. These things happen. They're unavoidable. We lose our innocence. We lose our respect. Maybe a lot of us here I've talked to that, have been moved here from someplace else. So we have friends and family that we lost when we moved away. We miss them. These type of things, they do affect us. They come into our lives, but they're unavoidable. But here's what I was talking about when loss is unavoidable, but grief is a choice. Here's the example. Let's say I lost a friend. I had a friend that moved away. Well, it's up to me whether I deal with that pain or not. So loss is going to come. It's that iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg that as we go through life, we're going to run into it from time to time. And it's up to us whether we choose to go through that iceberg or allowed to be stuck in it where everything underneath starts to get built up. And that comes from not grieving, from not choosing to grieve. And to tell you one thing, if you don't get anything from this whole message today, I want you to get this one statement here, that grief is the only way to get through loss healthily. Grief is the only healthy way to get through loss. And that is so important. Let's look at it this way. So let's say each one of us have an emotional bank. This is our emotions. All our emotions we store inside of us. And it has a vault. And a vault, if you look into a bank, a vault is not organic. It doesn't stretch. It doesn't grow. It is the size that it is, and it's solid and secure. So when good things come into our lives, we fill our emotional vault with hope and love and peace and laughter and joy and all those great things that we want to feel. But when loss comes, when that iceberg comes, and it's unavoidable, it's going to happen. These things are going to come into our lives. What ends up happening is we gain those emotions that are not so pleasant. That's grief. That comes from grief, anger, bitterness, sadness. Those type of things get deposited into our emotional bank. Now, what happens when we choose not to grieve, we choose not to expel those more unpleasant emotions, it starts to fill up our emotional bank. And so over time, like I said, it's not organic. It doesn't expand. It doesn't grow. We start depositing all these emotions that we preferably do not want to have. And that leaves no more room for the ones that we do want to have. So love and hope and peace and laughter and joy gets kind of pushed to the side because we're not spending the emotions that we need to spend. That grief is actually a part of our lives just as much as happiness and love. Let me tell you a little personal story here that a great example of why it's good to grieve. Before I started working for Story Church, I had a wonderful 15-year career in healthcare. I absolutely loved it. I loved the science of it. I loved helping people. It was really, really fun. I really enjoyed it. And the first several years, first 8 years, I actually worked in an emergency room. And those of you who have ever worked in the field or you've seen the TV shows or anything, you kind of have an idea of what goes on in those crazy places. Now, I'll tell you, I saw some funny, crazy stuff. Things that are glued together that shouldn't be glued together. Things that are stapled together, nailed together, should be stapled or nailed together. Things poking out of people's heads. The craziest things that people do to themselves, unintentionally, intentionally, or to each other. It's pretty crazy. But also, a lot of times, every day in that type of a field, you experience a lot of loss. You can imagine, not every patient makes it. Not every person, you have the best story for everybody else, the best news, the best diagnosis. Give you, this is a little bit of a sad story, just a little warning here. But I remember this one particular day where I had a little 3-month-old baby that had fallen off a bed and had come in, and she wasn't breathing, and we were, doing everything we could. We worked on her for 3 hours, and I had my hand, I was pumping on her heart for 3 hours. I'm sitting there, I'm keeping this little 3-month-old alive. We're trying to save this life, and she didn't make it. And I had to walk out of that room. Grief, bitterness, anger, confusion, sadness, all these things are flooding my heart. And I had to walk out of that room and walk right into the next patient's room. It was a 12-year-old boy that sitting there had just fallen off a ladder, just needed a cast on his arm. And I couldn't sit there and say, hey man, you're 12 and guess what I just went through? And I need to cry really quick here. I need to let this grief out. And, so I bottled that stuff in. I swallowed it, took it all in. And this job was continually doing that where it was like day in and day out, constantly going from loss to loss and not grieving. And even my coworkers were saying, like, Joel, you're really good at getting from one person to the other and not letting it affecting you. And I thought it was actually an admirable thing. I was like, yeah, I can do that. I'm really good at my job. And a lot of other emergency workers will say the same thing. That's part of the field. You got to do that. And I did that for so many years to the point where my emotional bank was full of all these emotions that I wasn't withdrawing. And I started to lose myself in the things that I really loved. My joy was nowhere. I would laugh, but it was manufactured laugh. It was laugh because I knew I was supposed to laugh. It wasn't true joy. Or I wasn't able to love, and it was affecting my relationships, my friendships. And these things were being affected, and I couldn't understand why that was happening. And to the one day, I was actually at a funeral of a friend of mine, and it was a young lady that had passed away, and I'm standing there in front of the casket, and I'm sitting there like, why don't I know how to feel right now? I literally felt like I was a complete emotional robot. I'm like pinching myself, like, cry, man, cry. And I realized I was like, something is wrong here. And I started to evaluate my life, and I was like, all right, I think I've not grieved. This thing that I've become because of the job that I was in, and it's a great job. Love those people that do that. They save our lives. But the force of not grieving on such an extreme basis caused me to become this stale, emotional human being. And what I ended up doing, I started acting out. I didn't know how to deal with the grief, so I started acting out. And I got into drugs and alcohol and all these type of things that were unhealthy. And it wasn't until years later until I found Jesus, and he opened my heart, and I learned to grieve. I talked to people. I sought counsel. I dealt with depression. I dealt with all these great things. And now I know how to grieve. And I see that it is actually a healthy option to go through the pain so I can actually smile later. And I just told this story for you. Now, that's an extreme story. I know that. But I really believe that can happen to any of us. Now, it may not be on a day-to-day basis like I had. And it may be for you. It could be, a simple little loss. It could be a loss of a best friend, or it could be a death, something big, and it deposits that huge amount of grief into your hearts. And then a little while later, and something else comes along, and you deposit a little more. And each time, it could be a slower pace than what I had. But over time, we start to build up the same exact thing to the point where we can't truly feel the emotions that we want to feel. The things of hope and peace and love and joy, all those things that we want to feel, there's no room for it because it's filled with all those things beneath the surface that really need to be let out. And the only way to actually do that is to grieve. Now, our society doesn't help us much. I don't know about you, but where you work at, but I remember one of my first jobs, And I remember reading the benefits package. I was 16. I was like, oh, I get benefits. That's pretty cool, right? Like I get paid and I get benefits. It's pretty cool. And I was going through and I saw this list that said, I get 2 funeral days. And I asked my boss, what's funeral days? And they're like, oh, if you have an immediate family pass away, you get 2 days. Like, only get 2 days? Like, seriously? And this is our lifestyle. This is our society. This is our culture that, we have a move on mentality or a get over it mentality. We don't take that time that is precious when loss comes, that we don't grieve. We don't expel those emotions that we really should expel. We hold them in. And we're trying to seek the emotions that we're actually trying to seek, the peace, the love, the hope, the joy, those type of emotions we want. We're not fulfilling those emotions because we're still stuck where we left that loss at, that we didn't actually grieve through that moment. In the book of Ecclesiastes, it was written by this man named Solomon. He was a really wise guy. He was one of the wisest men in the Bible, they say. And he wrote this thing, and he talks about seasons of life. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 1, he says, there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. So he says there's a time for everything, there's a season for things. And he goes on down to verse 4 where he actually talks about this specific subject. He says, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. See, there's a time to cry, so there can be a time to dance. There's a time to let the anger and the bitterness and the sad feelings, there's a time to go put yourself in a dark room and throw on some Jewel or some country music and cry. But so we can go to the next point where we can really dance. And we play some Ice Ice Baby, right? And we can actually dance. This is a part of life. So when we cancel out, we avoid and we ignore, we choose not to grieve. We choose not to let these emotions that are unpleasant to come out. We're avoiding the reality of being able to experience the good emotions, the joy, the peace that we really, really want to have. And that's why we need to choose grief so that we can laugh later. We need to choose grief so we can smile and love later, so our hearts are healthy and we're not holding in these unhealthy emotions. Now there's three biblical healthy ways to actually grieve, and they're phases, and I want to actually walk through them today. And I think if we go through these things, when loss comes, when it's unavoidable, that iceberg comes, and we deal with the grief, we take care of what we need to take care of underneath, and we don't allow that big hill, huge mass ice underneath, that we keep it small, then we can actually break through the iceberg. Because here's the thing, you can't get over a loss, you can't get around a loss, you actually have to go through it. And we can't go through it if it's that massive, right? We've got to let the things underneath the surface come to the surface, let's feel them so that we can get through it and we can get to the next loss. And we'll know how to deal with it, and we can get to the next loss. We'll know how to deal with it, and it gets easier. Even though it's unpleasant at the time, why would we choose to grieve? Because it's so unpleasant. It's bitterness, it's anger, it's all these things that we don't want to experience. But yet we need to experience it. Just like Solomon said, there's a time to mourn and there is a time to dance. If we experience these things, then we can experience the good things in life. Phase 1, real quick here, is pay attention. So a lot of times when loss comes into our life, we're off to the next thing. But if we stop and pay attention to the emotions of how we feel in that moment, then when we get to the next thing, we are a healthier person. Let me give you an example here. Let's say you lost your job, and, well, logistically, it's probably logically a smart thing to do is go try to find another one. That's good. But emotionally, well, a lot of times we throw ourselves into that next thing, that next job. And we didn't stop for a second and actually feel that disappointment, that embarrassment, that anger that may be surfacing underneath our surface. We expel that, then we can go to the next thing and do well. Or it's just like a relationship where, we get dumped. Those of you who are married, you may remember your single days. We get dumped. And a lot of times we have some wonderful friends that come over and they'll say, hey, I'm going to be with you. You know what, man? You need to get back in the game. You need to get back on that horse and ride. We don't stop for a second and grieve what just happened. And we take all that junk that we've been holding in and we take it right into the next relationship. It's unhealthy. But when we stop and we pay attention to our feelings in the moment, allow them to come out, allow ourselves to actually feel them, then we withdraw all that things from our emotions, and then we allow more room for love for the next person, for the next job, for the next thing that we're moving on. There's a great example of this in the book of 2 Samuel. And here in this story, there's a man named David, and he literally just became king. He became king because the previous king named Saul had died fighting this group of people called the Philistines. And also Saul's son, his name was Jonathan, had died too. And Jonathan was David's best friend in the whole world. He was like a brother to David. And Saul and David actually didn't quite get along at times. I mean, literally, Saul was trying to kill him at one point. But still, David saw Saul as somebody important, somebody he looked up to. So these two men were very, very important to David. But because they died in battle, David became king. Well, what does David do in this moment? Now, he's got a lot of responsibilities. I mean, he just became king. He's got to do a lot of king stuff, right? He's got to set up a kingdom. He's got to set up a capital. It's a war. There are nations at war. He needs to establish plenty of things. He's got plenty of next things to do. But what David does is so amazing. And I love David. God actually even calls David a man after his own heart. Can you imagine that compliment? God, the creator of everything, says, you're a man after my own heart. And here's David. He wasn't a perfect man, but here's David in a moment where he does the right thing. He stops and he pays attention to his emotions, and he actually grieves. And he does this really cool thing. Now, David was a very creative fella. He liked writing poems and songs, and the Bible says in some parts he liked to dance, he liked to play the harp. He was a very creative fella. He'd be probably a great worship leader today. So David liked to express his emotions through writing poems and songs. And so he writes this poem, this song, in the book of 2 Samuel, and he actually doesn't just keep it for himself, but he actually teaches his people to actually do this, and he calls it lamenting. Lamenting is another word for saying mourning, a passionate way of mourning. And he writes this very poetic lines about Saul and Jonathan. I want to read through here on this, and as we go, I want you to pay attention to some of the emotions that just are coming out of David here. And it starts in verse 17, or 2 Samuel, verse 1, verse 17. It says, David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. The glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have never dew nor rain. May no showers fall on your terraced fields, for there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul, no longer rubbed with oil. Right here we see some even anger coming out. I mean, he's cursing the Philistines and the areas they lived in for killing them. And it keeps going. He says, from the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. He's remembering who they are. He says, Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. He's choosing to remember them in the good ways that they were. He's letting that come out of him. He says, daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain in your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of a woman. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. I mean, it's just a very poetic thing, but you see and hear sadness. You see and hear grieving, a grieving man, a grieving king, teaching his people how to grieve. And he's allowing himself to stop and pay attention to his emotions before jumping on to the next thing. Now, the next thing, David goes on, he becomes a great king. He does great things, but he allows himself to stay in that moment, allow those things that could have potentially been underneath his surface of his life and the way he would have ruled his kingdom. If he didn't grieve, we don't know what might have happened, but he might have made some really bad choices because he was making decisions out of anger. He's making decisions out of sadness and bitterness. But because he stopped and paid attention to how he felt, he stopped and allowed himself to grieve, he was able to make wiser decisions as a king. It's pretty amazing. I mean, this is one of those spots, there's a lot of stories in the Bible where the guys didn't do the right thing, but here's one that actually did. And it's something really to learn from. I mean, we have a lot of responsibilities in our own lives, that we could jump, we have a loss and we can jump to the next thing. We've got to do it. We think, well, I just got to get to this next thing. I don't have time to have a pity party for myself. I don't have time to feel these things. But no, there is a time for that. And because you need to take that time to grieve that moment so you can be better on the other end. You can be a better person, a healthier emotional person if we stop and pay attention to who we are. I want you to look at it this way. If we don't grieve and we just go to the next thing, grieving or like a loss is like an open wound. So what happens when you get an open wound? You probably a good idea to clean it, keep it covered, make sure that it doesn't get infected. If we don't stop and pay attention to the wound, we don't take care of it, what happens? It does get infected. And what does an infection do? It starts to eat away at our bodies. It starts to hurt us. It starts to take over our body. We get fevers. We eventually get really sick, and eventually we will die if you don't take care of an infection. So it's the same thing. If we don't stop and pay attention to our wounds in our life, our losses, if we don't take care of it, we start getting sick on the inside. It gets nasty in there, and we get in trouble. But how we cure infection here in modern medicine, we use antibiotics. I'm sure in some time in your life, whether it was when you were little, you probably have had an antibiotic. Doctors like to write them out like candy. There's a reason why a doctor writes an antibiotic for a specific amount of days and a specific times of the days to take it. They're not making it up. There is scientific proof that, say a specific antibiotic you take twice a day for 10 days. And when I used to work in a doctor's office, we used to get calls from patients like a couple weeks later after they saw us. And they'd be like, man, I'm sicker than I ever was. What happened? What you gave me didn't work. And we're like, well, did you take all your antibiotic? Well, I felt good after about 3 or 4 days. And I stopped taking it. And you're like, yeah. So now you're sicker before, because what had happens if you don't take the full dose, if you don't truly purge that infection that's inside of you, the little bit that's left, it starts to grow again. And it gets stronger. It gets actually bigger than the first time, because now it's become resistant for what you tried before. So it's like this, when we experience loss, we get that open wound. But if we don't truly take all the medicine, we don't grieve everything that we need to grieve, we don't let all those unwelcomed, unpleasant emotions out of our lives, it starts to build back up and we become unhealthy. And we start to actually act out in bad ways. I mentioned earlier myself, I chose, drugs and alcohol, and maybe that's the case. But it could be some other things, probably look a little more innocent. It could be shopping, excessive shopping, spending money you don't have on things you don't really need, just trying to avoid those emotions you don't want. Or it could be entertainment, playing video games all day or watching movies constantly, just trying to escape the world that you're in because you want to feel the other people's fantasies. I mean, it seems something so simple, but you start to take on those things and you start to avoid the feelings that you really are feeling. I mean, let me throw this out at you too. Maybe it's even serving. Maybe it's even helping others, getting into their lives so you don't have to focus on your own. Even though you're doing a good thing, but we don't stop and feel our emotions. We don't stop and pay attention to how we feel at that moment. We don't move on to the next. When we move on to the next thing, it's just, we could end up really messing up a lot of things. So quickly here, just stop. When loss comes, phase 1, stop, pay attention to how you feel. There may be things you need to logistically do, but emotionally, don't move forward until you've expressed those things that need to be expressed. Do what you need to do. Stop and cry. Do whatever you need to do. Let it out so that you can be better on the other end. So if you get past phase 1, you stop and you pay attention, and you get to phase 2, it's real simple here. It's live it. Now, I'll be honest with you, phase 2 is not the fun one. This is where it comes out. This is where we take grief and put a verb attached to it, and we move forward with our grief. There's a great story in the book of John where Jesus does one of the most amazing things. I don't know if you've heard, all of what Jesus did, but he healed the sick, he gave sight to the blind. and he raised people from the dead. And this is one of those stories where Jesus had raised a man from the dead. And this particular story where we're at is Jesus just found out that his friend, one of his really good friends, Lazarus, had passed away. And he travels to where Lazarus is, and he's been dead for like 3 days. And he gets there, and he sees all the Jews, all the friends of Lazarus there, and they're crying, they're weeping, they're grieving, along with his sisters, Mary and Martha, who are very close to Jesus. They're grieving, they're crying. And here in this story right here, in John chapter 11, verse 33, we see how Jesus responds. Now, Jesus, he's the Son of God. He knows all the hope and peace in the world. He has all those great things inside of him. He knows the outcome. He knows he's about to raise this guy from the dead. They don't, but he knows this. But I want to pay attention to what Jesus does. Chapter 11, verse 33 says, "When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. 'Where have you laid him?' he asked. 'Come and see, Lord,' they replied. Jesus wept." You see that? It's the shortest verse in the whole Bible. It's 2 words. Jesus wept. Jesus cried. He took the time to cry. Now, what happens after that is the amazing part. It's the story we always tell. He said, "Lazarus, come forth." He stepped out of the grave. Everybody's like, "Whoa, what in the world? We got, this guy's dead and he's alive. We got zombies, whatever it is." That's the amazing part of the story. But there's something else really amazing here. He stops really quick and he cries. He grieves. He takes that time. He paid attention to his emotions. Jesus, the Son of God, he sees all his friends crying. He knows his friend is, I don't know how Lazarus died. He gets sick. Did he suffer? Jesus cried. He had emotion inside of him. Now, I'm not saying if Jesus didn't cry, that he couldn't have raised him from the dead. I don't know. That didn't happen. But I do see the Son of God stopping for a moment and living it out. He let that emotion come out. He stopped. He cried. There's no better way to be a man than to step out and cry and have those emotions done. Because Jesus was able to cry and to grieve. He was able to do the amazing things he was able to do. Why can't we learn from him? Why can't we learn that grieving actually is an option, that grieving is something that is necessary, it is healthy for us, and that Jesus himself, God, grieves with us. When we're hurting, when we're in trouble, he grieves with us as well, and that we need to grieve as well, that we need to let it out. We need to let the tears roll. Again, let's break out, get in the dark room and cry, let it out. Throw on the blues, sing it out there. Let ourselves feel that pain. Let ourselves feel those unpleasant emotions so that we can be better on the other end. I'm going to say this here. Say we need our tissues to get through our issues so our pain won't continue, right? We need to get those tools out. We need to get those tools out. Break out the tissues. Cry. Strong people actually cry. Strong people actually feel emotion. The weak people move past it and avoid it and start to act out. So what we need to do, we actually need to live out our emotions so we don't act out in unhealthy ways. All right, so after we've lived this out, and here's the fun part. We're on the home stretch now, phase 3. We need to change from it. This is the great part. This is really great. This is where we become something new. We've gone through it. We stopped. We paid attention to what we are feeling. We've actually lived it out. We let the grief play its course. Now we get to change. There's this great scripture in Matthew chapter 5, verse 4. Jesus is actually speaking. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's one of his most popular messages he ever gave. And he goes through and he lists a bunch of things, and it's called Beatitudes of different things that are blessed, different ways of living are blessed. And he says in Matthew 5, verse 4, it says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And I kept reading that over. It says, "Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who mourn." Like, wow. So if I don't mourn, I'm not blessed. Common sense, right? And when I do mourn, I will be comforted. That he plans on actually comforting me. So the first part, the blessed are those who mourn, that's steps, phase 1 and 2. Phase 3 is we become comforted. Well, what's a comforted person look like? Well, a comforted person, usually, I don't know about you, I like being comforted. I like feeling comfortable in myself. I like feeling healthy. I like feeling these things. But when we're healthy and we feel good, we become kinder. We become gentler. We become more humble. We become people that that like to come talk to us, we feel safer to others because what we've done, we've let all this stuff, that crud that's been underneath our surface, we've let it come out, and we're pleasant people because we know how to grieve. We know how to get through those unpleasant losses. I don't know if you've ever met somebody, you're kind of like, why are you always so happy? They have loss too. It's unavoidable. Things happen, but for some reason, some people are just really good at like, hey man, when I'm sad, I'm sad. I'm going to cry so I can dance later. And it's just so great to see those people. We're like, how do you do that? And I think if we don't understand it, it's because we never grieved. We never let those things out. But when we grieve, we become a better people. We've changed from it. And here's the other thing that really is awesome about it. We become people that can help other people. So if you've gone through a divorce or you've gone through a death of a family member and you've actually fully grieved that thing, now that's a part of you. You've experienced that. Well, then when the next person comes and they feel that and they don't know how to grieve, they're trying to move on to the next thing. You're like, hold, stop, don't do that. Look, you see how I went through that too. We talked a few weeks ago about a wounded healer. Yes, I'm wounded, but I know how to get through it. Come on, come with me. We become a new person. We can live a new story because we've allowed ourselves to grieve. And we can help others do the same thing. So we teach others. We become a new person. We change. I want to tell this real quick story here as the band comes on out. There was a doctor I used to work with, and when I first started working at this clinic, they always give you the rundown anywhere you work. You're like, hey, that person's cool, watch out for that person. You know what I'm talking about? And so I got the speech. You're like, hey, all the doctors are great, but that guy, that one, he's a bit grumpy, he's a bit emotional. If he looks a little unhappy, don't go talk to him. I mean, all these warnings, and I'm sitting there like, then nobody could tell me really why. And I found out a little later, I mean, the man had gone through literally hell. He had his grandson had passed away after like months of being in the hospital. They never found out what was wrong with, at least that I know of. And he passed away. He was 5 years old. The same month that happened, his sister died of cancer. And then he found out he had cancer. I mean, this guy literally just got bombed with losses. He had, iceberg after iceberg after iceberg. And I found this out. I'm like, well, no wonder he is, he's irritable. He's angry. He chose not to grieve those things. And he was just almost to see. He turns red. I mean, it's just like he's just boiling inside. And some time goes by, and then all of a sudden, we start seeing some changes in him, and he starts to loosen up. He becomes a great guy. I mean, actually, today is still one of my very good friends. And I'm starting to think, like, why do these people say that? I saw that in the beginning. I'm like, but he's like a super pleasant person now. And when I was actually leaving that office and I was coming to work for the church, he found out I was in church, and he's, people, when you say you work for a church, people just start telling you things. Let me just warn you. And he starts telling me, he's like, hey, Joel, I went through, all that crazy stuff, back then. I was like, yeah, I heard about that. And I didn't know if you were willing to talk about it. I was like, no, I want to talk about it. He said, I started talking about it, and I started to heal, and I started to cry. I started to grieve. I started to let these things out. And you know what? For the first time in my 30 years in medicine, and he's a pediatrician, he says, I feel like what I actually do is a ministry. He said, because I know you're going to ministry. He says, but I actually feel like now that I'm helping people. Isn't that crazy? And he says, I would never have felt that. I would never have learned that if I didn't go through what I went through. And then I learned that I was holding it in. I was so angry. I was angry at the world. I was angry at God. I was angry at everything. He treated it, those emotions like an alien invasion on his body. And he was like, I'm just rejecting it. And then when the day he realized, like, I got to let this out, I'm going to explode, he started to heal. And 4 years later, he's like, I see this as a ministry, and he's happy now. And he's doing it. Every day he's seeing kids, and he's got passion, and he's got love for them. He's like, I'm going to be their advocate more than I've ever been before. He changed from it. He became something new because he grieved. Now, he could have chosen not to, still be avoiding it today, be that angry man. He may not even be working today. Who knows? I mean, he looked unhealthy from it. But when we change, when we become that, when we allow ourselves to grieve, when we become better people, we can change and we can help others. And we can see even the things that we do in life every day as something new because we have allowed that junk that's underneath our surface of our lives. We allowed it to come to the surface, and we just smashed right through that loss. We smashed right through that iceberg. And when the next iceberg comes, we know how to deal with it. And we can help others get through that same iceberg. I want to challenge everybody today. When you go home today, maybe it's tonight, maybe it's tomorrow morning in a quiet time, break out a pen and paper and write down maybe some of those losses in your life. It could be something when you were a kid that you never grieved over. You never allowed yourself to feel, and you moved on to the next thing. And I'm not blaming you for moving on to the next thing. It doesn't feel good. But it doesn't feel good to not have hope and peace and love as well, to not have those emotions. So go home, write these things down, pray about them, ask God to comfort you. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Talk to somebody, seek wise counsel. This is what the church is for, people. This is why God gave us the church. There's people in this church that would love to talk with you and to pray with you and grieve with you. Hold your hand, put your arm around your shoulder. We want to be here for you. Maybe it's your connection. You're going to sign up for a connection group. Maybe it's your connection group leader. Maybe it's your pastor. Maybe it's somebody here. Talk to somebody. Go talk to a counselor. There's great counselors out there. Go talk to a therapist. Talk to somebody. Allow that to come out. Don't hold it in any longer. And maybe even something that happened when you were 14 years old that needs to come out. And I tell you, you'll feel better for it. You'll be a new person. You'll be changed. Maybe you're here today and you don't know Jesus. And you've been you're here and you're looking because you've lost something. And it's like, well, I've heard there's hope here. There is hope. You just got to reach out. Start a relationship with him. He will comfort you and get you through this because you can't go around it. You're stuck in that iceberg. It's time to let it go. It's time to move forward and allow Jesus to come into your life. He'll walk with you. He'll hold your hand. He will cry with you. He cried for Lazarus, and he still knew he was going to have hope. He was going to raise him from the dead. He will cry with you. He has hope for you too. There is hope for you. There's hope for all of us. So allow that to happen today. Allow ourselves to grieve. Because if we grieve today for yesterday and today, then we can smile tomorrow. There's a time for mourning and there's a time for dancing. There's a time for both. Live our whole lives. Allow ourselves to grieve because it's the only healthy way to get through a loss. Let's go ahead and pray real quick. Lord Jesus, I just thank you, Lord, for all these amazing people here. Lord, I don't know everybody's stories. I don't know everybody's heart, God, but I do want to pray, Lord, that if there's something inside any of us that we have not grieved, that we have not let out, God, I pray, Lord, you soften our hearts, Lord, and allow us to take that step forward, to grieve, to allow you to heal us so we can help others, so we can find hope and we can find love. God, I pray, Lord, for everybody's emotional bank, Lord. I pray, Lord, that you open our hearts, Lord, to let love come in. Especially if somebody here that doesn't know you today, God. I pray, Lord, that you open them up, Lord, to hearing from you, God. I pray, Lord, that we are a church here, God, that takes in people that are hurt and that they've experienced loss and teach them to grieve because we know how to grieve. I pray, Lord, that Story Church becomes a place where people that have lost know that they can come because they have people there that know how to get us through. God, I just love you, and I thank you, Lord, for this opportunity for all of us to come together and create a place of community that we can be together, that we don't do this alone. You said in your word that it is not good for man to be alone. Well, God, thank you for bringing us this church and this people. I pray, Lord, for anybody here today that may be experiencing loss, they may be experiencing it right now, and they need hope, and they need to cry it out. God, I pray, Lord, that they reach out to somebody and they talk to somebody and allow that to happen, allow themselves to heal. In Jesus' name, amen.